911 dispatchers hear fear every day, but at 3:17 a.m. they got a call that still haunts them. The voice on the other end wasn't crying. It wasn't frantic. It was calm. Too calm. "I've done something," the caller said. "You'll find them in the basement, exactly how I left them." For a moment there was silence. Then, just before the call ended, a chilling detail. "I know how this will play out. Every single step." What police found at that basement shattered everything we thought we knew about crime. 3 bodies, 3 different states, no apparent connection. But then, investigators noticed something. The way they were posed, too precise, too calculated. A notebook at the scene, filled with notes about the victims, not just about their lives, not just about their habits, about the investigation itself. The journal predicted everything: which detective would be assigned, which forensic tests would be run, even what the media would say. One line stood out more than anything else. "They'll think they're chasing me, but really, they're following my design." Detectives scrambled to understand. Had this been done before? Were there more victims? Then came the discovery that changed everything. The pattern stretched back decades. This wasn't just one person. This wasn't just about murder. It was something far worse, and we were already part of it. To understand how deep this goes, we need to go back to where it all began. There was nothing unusual about Maple Grove, Pennsylvania. It was the kind of town where kids rode their bikes past white picket fences, where shop owners knew customers by name, where people still left their doors unlocked at night. But beneath that perfect surface, something was wrong. It started subtly. A college student stopped showing up for class. His friends assumed he was sick. His professors thought he had dropped a course. No one thought much of it. Then, a jogger disappeared. She ran the same route every morning. One day, she never came back. And then a night shift worker failed to clock in. His car was still in the driveway. His uniform was laid out on his bed, but he was gone. 3 people. No signs of struggle. No obvious connections. Detective Michael Reynolds had seen plenty of missing persons cases in his 15 years on the job. Most had simple explanations: runaways, accidents, even the occasional abduction. But something about this didn't sit right. Each case felt too clean, too sudden, like they had vanished without a trace because someone had planned it that way. Then the first body was found. It was inside an abandoned factory, hidden deep in the industrial outskirts of town. The scene was unsettling. The victim was posed, arms folded, head tilted slightly, eyes open. Not in a struggle, not in fear, but in something eerily precise. It was almost intentional. There was no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, no blood splatter, nothing that pointed to how the victim had been taken or killed. But there was something else. Next to the body, carefully placed on the floor, was a journal. Reynolds picked it up and flipped through the pages. What he saw made his blood run cold. The entries weren't written by the victim. They were written about them, their daily routine, where they liked to go, who they spoke to, what time they left home. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The final pages contained something no one expected: predictions. It detailed exactly how the investigation would unfold, who would discover the body, how the police would analyze the scene, even the detective who would be assigned. It was signed with a single chilling sentence: "You are exactly where I wanted you to be." Reynolds slammed the journal shut. He had never seen anything like this before. And he had no idea what was coming next, because this was just the beginning. The next crime scene confirmed our worst fears, and what we found there shattered everything we thought we knew about criminal psychology. The first crime scene was chilling, but the second, it was undeniable proof. 12 days after the first victim was found, another body appeared, this time in an abandoned house miles away. And just like before, the victim was posed, carefully, deliberately. No fingerprints, no signs of struggle, no forensic evidence that made sense. But there was something even more disturbing. Lying beside the body was another journal. Detective Michael Reynolds flipped through the pages, his heart pounding. Just like the first, it described the victim's last moments in terrifying detail. Their routine, their conversations, their final hours. And then, another prediction. A precise breakdown of how the investigation would unfold, who would find the body, how the authorities would react, even what the media would report. The handwriting was different this time, but the message was the same. You are exactly where I wanted you to be." Reynolds knew this wasn't the work of a lone psychopath. This was something else, something organized, something calculated, and someone somewhere was watching. By now, the FBI had joined the case. Dr. Lisa Parker, a forensic analyst with years of experience, was called in. She had seen her share of violent crime, but nothing like this. As she examined the second crime scene, one detail stood out: a 17-minute gap in the surveillance footage. 17 minutes, completely missing. The same exact gap that had been found near the first crime scene. It was as if someone had deliberately erased those moments over and over again. The same amount of time, the same method, the same invisible hand controlling everything. But that wasn't all. When detectives interviewed witnesses, things got even stranger. A man swore he saw a figure leaving the scene, wearing a blue jacket. Another said the person was in red. A third? No jacket at all. The contradictions weren't just confusing. They felt intentional, like someone wanted the truth to stay just out of reach. Dr. Parker sat with Reynolds, flipping through reports, piecing together patterns, and then she said something that made his stomach drop. "This isn't a serial killer. This is an experiment." Reynolds stared at her. "An experiment?" She nodded. "They aren't just studying their victims, they're studying us." At first it sounded impossible, but then the evidence started to align. Library records showed psychology books on profiling kept disappearing. Old case files had been repeatedly accessed and refiled, and deep in the digital archives, a forensic analyst found something terrifying. A cold case. From 20 years ago, a different town, a different victim. But the same posed bodies, the same missing footage, the same chilling messages, and the worst part? It wasn't just one case, it was many. For decades, this had been happening, again and again. The names had changed, the locations had changed, but the pattern had not. Someone had been rehearsing this, perfecting it, and now they were watching how investigators responded, not to get away with murder, but to learn, to control, to predict. Reynolds felt a cold sweat on his skin. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. This was a game, and they had been playing right into it. And the more they uncovered, the more it became clear. This wasn't just about predicting their moves. It was about controlling them. The third crime scene confirmed our worst fear. This wasn't the work of one person. It was something far bigger. The first two crime scenes had been terrifying, but the third, it changed everything. It was more elaborate, more deliberate, more perfected. The victim posed just like the others, the eerie symmetry, the unsettling precision. But something was different this time. Near the body, detectives found another journal. At first, it seemed just like the others. A detailed record of the victim's movements, notes on their habits, an eerie timeline of their last moments. And then, something new. The pages weren't just about this victim. They referenced others, cases from decades ago, cold cases that had never been solved. The same patterns, the same missing surveillance footage, the same 17-minute gaps. This wasn't a single killer. This wasn't the work of a lone psychopath. This was something bigger, a network, a system, a study that had been happening for years, hidden in plain sight. Dr. Robert Thompson sat in silence, flipping through the journal's pages. Finally, he looked up. His voice was quiet, but firm. "These aren't just killers. They're researchers." That one sentence changed the course of the entire investigation. Because what if these murders weren't just about death? What if they were about data? The team combed through the journals looking for connections, and what they found sent a chill through the room. The positioning of the bodies, the precise witness contradictions, the way each crime was designed to provoke a certain reaction, from the public, from the media, from law enforcement. It was psychological testing. They weren't just watching how people died, they were studying how people responded, how detectives followed clues, how witnesses misremembered details, how the news shaped public perception. Dr. Lisa Parker leaned back in her chair, staring at the evidence. "They're not just experimenting on victims," she said. "They're experimenting on all of us." The implications were horrifying. For decades, someone had been orchestrating these crimes, testing theories, refining methods, learning how to manipulate investigations, how to control narratives, how to disappear into the cracks of a system that was never built to catch them. And just when the team thought they understood the scope of it, they found the final piece. A message hidden deep within the latest journal. Not a confession, not a taunt, a warning. A list of names, investigators, reporters, and even people following the case online. The message was clear. You are part of this now. Reynolds felt his breath catch stop being about the past. Now it was about the future. Because the experiment wasn't over. It was just beginning. The final crime scene wasn't what anyone expected. There was no body, no blood, no staged display like before. Just a single table in the middle of the room. And honest. Names. Detectives, journalists, forensic analysts, people working on the case, people reporting on the case, and even people watching the case. Reynolds felt his stomach drop as he scanned the list. Some of the names had already been crossed out. This wasn't a record of victims. It was a record of participants. Dr. Harris flipped through the notes left behind. They weren't just monitoring law enforcement. They were studying reactions, every article, every press release, every podcast, every comment thread, tracked, logged, analyzed. They weren't just watching the investigation. They were shaping it, testing how narratives spread, how panic grew, how people processed fear. Dr. Parker looked up, her voice unsteady. This was never just about murder. They weren't predicting behavior. They were controlling it. For decades, this organization had been running a live experiment on society itself. Each case, each victim, each carefully constructed crime scene, all designed to measure response. How police would react, how the media would frame it, how the public would engage with it. Every crime wasn't just a killing, it was a psychological test. And the results? The organization had been refining them for years, adapting, learning. They understood fear better than anyone. They understood how to manipulate it. Reynolds felt his breath quicken. If they've come this far, what's next? No one had an answer, because for the first time, the investigators realized they weren't chasing killers. The killers were chasing them, and somewhere, someone was still watching, still documenting, still learning. And the 17-minute gaps, they were still happening, right now. But the biggest question remained, how far had this experiment spread, and who exactly was behind it all? The case was closed, or at least that's what the official reports said. But no one who worked on it believed that. Not really. Because even after the task force disbanded, even after the final press conference, the 17-minute gaps never stopped. Surveillance cameras in random cities would still go dark, always for the same amount of time. Case files still went missing. Key witnesses, people who had spoken publicly about the investigation, started retracting their statements. Some even disappeared altogether. And then there was the list, the one found at the final crime scene, the one that had included the names of investigators, reporters, and audience members. The FBI tracked the IP addresses of people who had accessed public case files. There was a pattern. Those who had followed the case too closely, those who had dug too deep. Some had been watched, some had been contacted, and a few had simply vanished. Detective Reynolds, the man who had started it all, refused to speak on record after the final discovery. But off the record, he had just one thing to say. We thought we were chasing them, but the whole time, they were pulling us in. Law enforcement agencies across the country scrambled to change their protocols, to close the gaps, to cover their blind spots. New policies were introduced, new investigative techniques were developed. But some experts believed that was exactly what the organization wanted. Because if they had spent decades studying the system, wouldn't they have already planned for this? Wouldn't they have already predicted this response? And if they had, then maybe we weren't shutting them down. Maybe we were helping them perfect their methods. The final report was filed. The final press release was issued. But behind closed doors, the biggest question remained unanswered. How many others are part of this organization? How long have they been watching? And the most chilling question of all, who will be their next experiment? Because somewhere out there, in a city where nothing seems wrong, where people still leave their doors unlocked at night, someone is watching, waiting, documenting. And the experiment? It isn't over. Not yet.
Before you go, if you want to be the first to know when we uncover the next buried truth that could affect your community, hit subscribe now and turn on notifications. Our investigations have already saved lives, and your support keeps this vital work going. Don't miss our next revelation. Subscribe now, because what you don't know can hurt you. Join our community of truth seekers today.